Hello, everyone. Welcome to Voices with Vervaeke. I'm here again for the second time with Tyler Hollett, and he and I are going to discuss a very important issue that I think is deeply relevant to this idea of stealing the culture, of trying to build an alternative way of being for human beings that addresses the meaning crisis. Homes and ecology of practices might be the cultural base for the religion that's not a religion, etc. Very grandiose things we're saying right now, but nevertheless, that's sort of the nexus of what we want to talk about. So welcome, Tyler.
Thank you, John. And as I just said before to you, it's really good to be here, and I really appreciate your time. I think our hope that what comes of our conversation will be useful, if not to us, to other people that can listen in on it, and that some collective and group effort will be able to produce some insights that we can all feed back into each other. At least that's definitely something that I've received from you on numerous occasions, and lots of people in this little, what are we calling it, this corner of the internet, right?
Yeah, Sabella King's notion for it, I think, is really wonderful.
Sure, yeah. There's certainly a notion of community that it evokes, and one that I feel.
Yeah.
Right. I'm moving around lots of different, eclectic groups, like diverse and strange groups, and I think there's despite the diversity and the strangeness of us all, there is a sense of doing something together and appreciating some element of what we're going through together, and a certain part of culture that's emerging from it. So yeah, that's really what I'm very interested in talking about today, is how this is starting to unfold, how it is, what it is we're actually looking for as we gather together to do this. Like, why the hell are we spending all this time doing this? What do we feel is missing? And then as we're going through this process, what's the set of relationships that are occurring naturally as they're unfolding, and what's being produced by each of those sets of relationships? And I thought that your work in particular, and the way that you have such keen insight on how it is that our cognition functions, and what it's the important processes of, like, zooming in and zooming out, and understanding the different layers of insight, I think, and wisdom. I hope that we can discuss maybe an understanding of how these patterns unfold, and maybe how we can utilize them in group cognitive efforts. And I'm going to be working soon with Tim Adolin and some others on ephemeral group work, and I think that maybe is also something we can discuss.
Yep, I'd love to. I love everything that Tim is doing. Always count me in as interested in that. So Christopher Mastropietro and I are in the middle, more than the middle now, I can happily say. We've been working on an anthology that's got many of these people from this corner of the internet, including Sabella King, who named it thusly. And it's called In and Outer Dialogues, and it's about trying to understand the dialogical process, how it's working in distributed cognition, how we can create new psychotechnologies. My project with Chris of trying to sort of reinventio dialectic as a practice for engaging dialogos, but all of this, many of the usual suspects are appearing in that anthology. So yeah, there's a lot of thought going in right now to, you spoke a moment ago, just before we started the recording, about, sort of the software aspect of it, the culture and the cultural cognitive aspects of what seems to be emerging. I agree with you, the technology is already there, or mostly there. I think it still needs to be improved to reduce some of the cognitive load issues. But yeah, I agree with you. The interesting thing to be talking about right now, I mean, this sounds sort of silly to say, but what is happening? What is happening at the cultural cognitive level? And you said you've had some sort of insights and realizations about what is drawing people into this space, some of the commonalities they might have, some of the shared visions they might have. So what is drawing people into this space, and what's keeping them in this space, and what are their shared hopes about this space? What do you think about that?
It's a great question.
Thank you.
So, like, in examining anything, my mind is always drawn to this natural process whereby I consider a thing and its history, and I project it into the future as well, right?
Right.
Like
Excellent.
it just
Excellent.
happens, like it just
Yeah.
I cling to a thing. I'm like, aha, it came from somewhere. Where did it
Right.
come from? And then like, what is it going to be doing? And I think, yeah, this is a really big portion of what the brain is doing, right? Like
Mm.
it's trying to understand the environment. Yeah, but yeah. So trying to get to know what it is that brought us here is a big part of what we're doing. In fact,
Mhm.
talking to each other about our histories, right?
Yes. Yes.
And then
Yes.
in the sharing of that, we see these commonalities. We're like ants smelling the pheromone trail, kind of,
Right.
right?
Right. Right. Right.
Ah,
Right.
that smells very familiar. I've been on that track, right?
Right. Right. Right.
And we get a sense, I think, of, all right, so we all arrived in the same spot, and you can kind of think of it as like pilgrims are going on a journey, and
Yep.
we've all
Yep.
gathered in this one location. You're kind of looking around, you're like, well, what brought us here, and where did we come from? And I think in the
Excellent
sharing of this,
analogy. But sorry for interrupting, Tyler, but I
no,
really love the analogy. Please continue. I love that analogy. Please keep going.
well, it's like an oasis too. Each of these
Yeah.
little spots are like oases, and because that really is part of the meaning crisis and the domicile aspect
Yeah.
of it, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like going out into the world is being presented with a harsh desert, right? There's no sustenance there
Yeah. Yeah.
from which we drink, and so I think that to just jump ahead and answer, that's really what most of us are looking for, is
Right.
that level of sustenance. There's a um, it's a thirst for which there is no clear organ by which we imbibe it, right?
Right.
It's like this
Oh. Yeah.
coordinated, orchestrated thing of getting to know and cherish and love your like networked group of people. Like it's just getting to know your neighbor
Mhm.
and understand what a neighbor really is, let's say. And yeah, so that is part of like, so with nothing much to do but speak with each other, right? You end up talking about these histories and getting to understand how common these certain themes are
Mm.
in experiencing trauma or experiencing certain kind of impositions in life that require us to, necessity is the mother of invention, right? It's like they
Right. Right.
require us to summon forth either the strength or the ingenuity or natural talent or all of that combined to overcome.
Mhm.
And in the overcoming, we acquire a certain skill and a maturation of thought with this process of insight. And I think that's why we all kind of find ourselves in these certain places, talking about similar things, looking for similar answers. Um, yeah. So, and that's part of the self-selecting process, by the way.
Right. Right.
That's
Right.
moving in towards like a deeper question of what it is we're doing here, which is like, now that we're here, what do we do? Right? Like, but
Right.
now that you're at the oasis, do you build a little tent structure? Is it like do you erect like an ephemeral little city? Is it something that you found a new civilization upon? Is like,
Right.
is enough water there? Can you
Yeah.
build it up into something big? It doesn't seem so yet, right? Like it
Right.
seems like we're definitely lacking a lot of the infrastructure that you
Yep.
would need for something like a city. But I want to not belabor that metaphor too much because I actually despise cities in many ways. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I'm not really looking to recreate that necessarily. Yeah, there's yeah, so that's yes, we are here looking for that which we most appreciate, which is being known, being recognized for what it is that we've done and experienced and overcome, and seeing that in others, right?
Mhm.
And that is the process of inspiration,
Right.
which acts as a kind of resource
Right.
that we're missing.
Right.
So yeah, you're all about the insight and wisdom and inspiration, and that's so much of what we need now in the presence of misinformation and um, like willful, like culpable misleading of people,
Yes. Yes.
demagoguery, like all this crazy stuff happening right now, which is
Yep.
yeah. Anyhow, I don't want to get too political, but yeah, there's so much of that which is mitigated or even swept aside entirely when you get to know the person that you're being civil with, right? That you're building civilization with.
Right. Right.
And that's what we're missing, really. That is what the domicide is that lack of connection, lack of feeling at home. So I'm really curious about how to build that feeling in a very rapid way, right? Whereby you can travel amongst a diverse range of people and feel at home,
Mm,
right? And to be in the presence of others who also feel the same. So there was a reciprocal nature there that lends itself to the opening process, to that reciprocal opening. And
right, right, right.
that's such an important element, it seems, of navigating novel situations, and especially like rapid novelty, which is exactly what we're in, a circumstance where it's a lot of chaos and
Right,
very complicated situations, and all of that requires uh, a certain kind of Zen openness, like
right,
right, like
right,
being
right.
receptive to the jazzy, impromptu nature of what it is to respond with it with adaptive capacity and the optimum grip, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what I'm curious about, and that's what I think we're doing here. That's what I'm doing here.
That was beautifully said, Tyler. That's why I just wanted to let you keep going, keep talking. So it's like people have been traumatized and starved, if, to various degrees, by the meaning crisis and other crises that are related to it. I'm just trying to make sure I understand you. And so they're drawn. I like your sort of intuitively, right, and they start to be drawn together into a place where they can talk about that, but also talk in a way that starts to alleviate that. Have I understood you correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've felt it alleviated in myself at least, and
Yes.
I know I can speak to a certain smaller group that I'm in direct contact with, and I can speak directly for and say there's some alleviation there. But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that's the feedback I'm getting generally. And I was at it'll come out soon. I was 2 weeks ago. I spoke at the Movement Summit that was put together by Rafe Kelly,
Mm.
uh, and I was impressed, almost overwhelmed by the number of people. And I've entered into a bunch of this ongoing discussions, like with Nick Winkleman, I believe is his last name, um, with a bunch of people. But the power, the quality, the sophistication of the thinking, but how much it was matched by the power, the quality, the sophistication of the practice, and how that was in turn, both of those were homed within all these emerging communities that are networking together. Like there is a lot happening out there right now, and this part of it, this meeting together virtually, is part of whatever this is that's happening. I mean, obviously I think it's people are responding to the meaning crisis by coming up with ecologies of practices, and at least a subculture by which they're trying to, um, you know, coordinate these ecologies of practices and curate them to improve religio. That's all happening, and it's happening. Like when I started this project, geez, it was like just not that more than like a year and a half ago, and I didn't know any of you guys, any of these people, like I was mostly pessimistic, and I mean, there's a lot that's happening that's very chaotic and very dangerous, like you said right now. But the fact that this corner of the internet is taking shape, and there's other and it's and there's other related corners, and that this corner of the internet is just a corner of a bunch of communities that are also springing up, and they're all wanting to talk to each other. They're all wanting to and it's not a competitive talking. It's an edification. They want to edify and beautify each other and help each other. I mean, I'm not. I don't. I'm not going to break into a song by the Beatles right now or anything like that. But yes. So there was a lot. There's a lot happening right now that really exemplifies what you're talking about. There's this huge drawing together. People are finding themselves, and it's being accelerated by this technology. And they're not just finding themselves; they're finding alleviation and amelioration, and also inspiration and aspiration. And then your question, I think, becomes the pertinent question. It's the exact right question to ask is, well, what should I do? What should I do to help this?
Yeah.
And I think that's the question. That's the question that immediately comes to mind.
Right. And that's spread across a whole range of people too.
Yes, yes,
What's
yes,
really interesting about this, like in my younger days, I saw the world quite differently, right? Um, I'm still kind of full of the fire and vigor of youth, let's say, but there's definitely a different texture to it. There's an impetuousness to youth, right? There's a rushing headlong into it that I've definitely noticed a decline in. And
yeah,
the way that I see the world, because of that change, that alteration, right? Like it's apparent in the way that I speak, the kinds of things that I will agree to, my opinions, all that is expressed in just this more care, right?
yeah,
So I have children, like I watch the headlong nature of youth, right? Like my whole responsibility, it seems, is to teach them care. It's such
right.
an interesting way to think about it too,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
it helps save me from the desire to, reach out and like terrible frustration, because there's something, I've really struggled with this too as a father, because I didn't think I'd ever have like these moments of frustration and difficulty. But it'll always be, roses, right? Like,
yeah,
nice
yeah,
and um, well, it has something to do with the care for life.
yeah,
There's a haphazardness to what it is to be a babe and a toddler, and it's so fascinating, because it is both. It's like simultaneously this over effusive joy for life.
yeah,
It's in that joy you're completely missing all of the terrible
yeah,
misfortune, right? You're actually it, in fact, the more bumbling you are, the more joyful you are, the more care needs to be taken by the people around you,
yeah,
right?
exactly,
And
exactly.
that's
Very
so
well said.
interesting. Yeah, and that reciprocal process turns them to each other in a sense, right? So and then I think if it's done properly, it acts as a resource that feeds into it. You get a closed loop. You get like a closed economy,
Right.
right? So and this is what's being broken by much of the modern era, I think. You can define it this way. What was once a kind of closed loop economy, a marketplace of these like inner space resources of human social networks, they're being siphoned by all of these other attentive efforts in the world.
Yeah,
And that is just, it's kind of fracturing the whole, it's giving lending fragility to the whole structure that existed upon that ecosystem before. Anyhow, yeah, so the keen insight that I seem to have like fixated upon is something like our own experiences in life conform us to something, to some shape, and then we see the world according to that shape.
yes,
And then it affords us some set of skills and capacities or opportunities that that works to a certain extent, right? In a certain regard, like in a certain moment, in a certain situation. It's
right.
best to be as adaptable as you can, but as you age in life, you acquire a fixedness, but also an expertise,
Yep,
right? You
yeah,
get that simultaneous narrowing
yeah,
and vertical. And
yeah,
so but all right. So if you take a real like high level view of this, it seems like there are these kind of archetypal relationships that people narrow into in expertise land. And that if you assemble, so if you think of the sage, if you think of, think of the sage or the Buddha, or it's always described as a path which leads to um, the expression of this nature, right? This certain kind of nature. And it's a set of characteristics and virtues. So each of us being a fractal of that possibility, that potential, diminished in capacity, let's say, or acquiring numerous corruptions and being weak. If we somehow configure ourselves together into a synergistic whole, we can reproduce that sage
yeah,
in part, right? That's
yes,
my sense of it.
yes,
And that's what actually represents the good dialogos, is
yes,
when that full figure is met by the total group,
yep,
right? That's the expressive, like ineffable aspect of what can't be grasped, is
yeah, yeah,
that thing which is outside of you all. And yeah, that's my sense. Sorry, I'm kind of,
No, no, no. That's excellent. I mean, um, uh, that's I mentioned, the anthology. That's an idea that's coming out in the anthology. This idea of the third factor, the logos, the geist that comes into distributed cognition and is actually perhaps a better model for the sage um, than one than an individual.
sure, sure.
Um,
Yeah.
uh, uh, and that this is very convergent with a lot of emerging cognitive science. Greg Enriquez in his work, and then Mercer and Sperber on their work, and the idea that cognition is usually and should mostly be done in distributed cognition. Excuse me, distributed cognition. That human cognition evolved to work largely dialogically.
Yeah.
So to give a concrete example, um, monologic reason tends to be beset by all kinds of bias. But when people enter into distributed cognition and they're willing to give their allegiance to the overarching process of opponent processing rather than adversarial processing,
Right.
then they will typically do much better at, uh, at reasoning and problem solving than individuals. Now, groups have their problems too. You have groupthink, you have diffusion of responsibility. So like you said, you have to do something on the software. You have to build the right culture so that you get the best out of the distributed cognition. But here's how I put it. The best of distributed cognition is much better than the very best of monologic cognition.
Right. Yes.
And so we should always compare apples to apples, right? And
Well,
so,
okay, but there's something interesting about this because,
okay, go ahead.
oh, sorry, no, 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 don't interrupt. Yeah, I can hold the thought. Yeah.
Okay, so please hold your thought. Well, all I wanted to say is that, but we don't have to choose between them. We can, and this is what you see in the Platonic and the Socratic ideals of dialogos, the individual cultivation of wisdom and the collective cultivation of wisdom, right, can actually be put into sync with each other. So they mutually reinforce and facilitate each other.
Right. Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and I think that's the best sort of presentation. And then what happens is you sort of the distributed cognition gives you one of the better symbols for the sage, but the individual practices, right, obviously facilitate the distributed cognition, but they also allow individuals to more appropriately and effectively internalize that sage within their own individual cognition.
Right. Yeah. You can't help but become more like that thing that
Yes,
you seek and that calls you out. Right.
yes, yeah,
And that is distributed, this multi-perspectival thing, right? It's,
exactly,
and
exactly.
you're never getting fixed, and you're always adaptive. And okay, but the other element of that though is something like people seem to be more inspired by the singular, like, even your language there, the Platonic, the Socratic, like we
Yep,
refer to like
yep,
the source of inspiration, and that usually seems to adhere to a character, right?
yep,
Christ. But then, even with Christ, what did he do? What is his process? Assemble a group of 12,
yep.
right? And then those 12, I think, was the 72, and then that was supposed to ripple outwards.
And then the church itself, the ecclesia itself.
Right, right. The body becomes the
Yep.
body, right?
And
And then
For the Buddha, it's the Sangha, and for the Socratic tradition, it's the Platonic Academy takes
right,
takes shape around it. Yeah.
right. Yeah, and all of those things are reaching towards like the same set of transjective relationships, right? Like
Yes.
the same set of goals, right? Which is something like to reverence and uphold the process itself and the people that are having that process undergo. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I've made part of the problem, if we do again, how do we get here? Part of the problem might be, to some degree, a Protestant individualism that has tended to uh, resituate history that way and sort of glom onto individuals. It's also sort of narratively, heuristically useful. It simplifies things. But
Sure, sure.
I'm thinking about, right, the Catholic, or perhaps even better, the Eastern Orthodox versions, where, first of all, you have a Trinity, and then right, and then you have the saints, and then you have the church, and you're supposed to see the whole thing, right? Christ is at the center, but Christ is not the sole, right? Christ is married to the church, for example. The church is his body, right? You're supposed to see a deep co-identification between the representation of the wise individual and the wise body. You're supposed to
He's
see them as deeply belonging together.
supposed to be broken into pieces and decentralized and distributed.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's the notion. That's I think that's what the whole sacramental notion was supposed to teach. If I'm horribly mistaken, I'm
Well,
not
the
sure.
idea is, yeah, you're supposed to. The sacrament is you. Yeah, the idea is you break it up and you distribute it. So that's the differentiation, because
Yeah.
you're right. But then everybody does it together, which is then the communitas, the drawing together.
Right.
So the idea is you reach out in differentiation to meet people where they are, right? But then you're supposed to draw them together so that they can afford, right, that third factor, right? The
Right.
logos.
Yeah. We were just discussing this the other day, my fiance and I, this over adherence to a heroic narrative,
Yeah.
which is definitely tied in with the kind of over messianic notion,
Yep.
and the over Protestant work ethic kind of
Yep.
individualistic notion. It's all in there with the kind of American dream ideal. It's
Yep.
all baked into that when I was growing up. And yeah, it's really, it's like it's skewed the media a lot.
It has.
Even the way that we interpret other structures, it starts to be through the filter of like, is it heroic or not, or is it? You just look at the way that we revere any of the celebrities now, like even in the tech industry, like
Yep.
take Elon Musk. I mean, there's a million messianic figures that are supposed to offer some kind of method of salvation of some kind, wealth and prosperity for us all. And yeah, there's something to that. There's a quote that often echoes in my mind, from Emerson, which is an essay or maybe a lecture he gave on the American philosophers. Genius is always sufficiently the enemy of genius by virtue of over influence.
Mm.
There's something that, like, that overly attractive element of something, it fixates attention, right? It causes people to lose some element of their vitality and trade to, like, their attention to that thing.
Yeah.
At least I've noticed that happens so often, right? And it becomes this tawdry connection, right? That's not of any real value, and there are these cheap tokens of attention that are sought after, and it doesn't seem to integrate well with the other modes of being, and it seems to sap and narrow, right? That reciprocal narrowing kind of addictive process. Yeah, I think that is all baked up in that, and there is something more important to the notion of like a Piagetian equilibration thing, where you're working inwards and outwards,
Yep.
and it's deeply tied into knowing that you're tied into all of that, right? And that your strength is only really defined by like how well that extends. So
So Tillich actually saw this. Ironically enough, he's a Protestant theologian, but he's in many ways considered one of the last theologians, because he proposed the God beyond the God of theism. I don't mean historically the last, I mean sort of conceptually along a particular line of conceptual development. But Tillich proposed that the challenge, and he's, the challenge facing a religion, he was speaking specifically about Christianity though, is how to balance the tonos, the creative tension, the opponent processing between the irremovable, but in some sense, not finally reconcilable, right? Tension, the poles of individuation and participation.
yeah,
And one way in which people try to solve this, and I'm putting that in scare quotes, I think, is they try to collapse participation into a particular individual. And then they just assimilate their own individuation. They project their own individuation.
proxy, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And
Mm-hmm.
so they actually abandon the project of individuation, in the projection, but they also correspondingly, without realizing it, they abandon most of what is available to them in participation.
Right.
Because the participation degenerates, as you said, to, I think you called it something like sort of, superficial tokens of attention. It's just a kind of basic connectedness to the figure that's supposed to be sufficient. And that's not what participation means. Participation means what we were talking about earlier, that you and I can together get to a place where we individually can't get to on our own, right? That's the participation phenomenon.
And it
And
draws you forth
yeah,
further and more, right? Always.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And, and there's a sense in which they need each other. This is Tillich's point, the individuation and the participation. And one of the things I see the Dialogos Project as trying to give prominence to is exactly that fact, that we've got to enter into a way of talking to each other that is getting us to call up the first person perspective of individuation and the third person perspective of participation within the second person perspective of this shared we, of the
Right.
shared, right?
That's really well said. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, that's really well said, because that closes the loop on all of it. And that's what you need.
Yes, I think
Yeah.
so. I
Yeah,
think so.
right. You need
I,
each to feed back into the other.
and,
Yeah.
I'm trying to draw from these models, the models of the ecclesia, the church, the sangha, but also the academy. I'm trying these various models of how people have tried, because I don't think there's any final solution to this, but trying to get sort of what are some overall features that will allow us to understand better how these communities form when they form well. And what does that look like? Uh, as a way of trying to answer your question about like how do we go forward. I'm reading a really good book by Fowler right now on what's it called, spiritual midwifery. It's about, and he actually uses the word dialogos, which like well, I've never met the guy, he's never met me. It's just really cool. But he's actually, what he's doing is he's running in his book a dialogue between the midwifery you see in Jesus and the midwifery you see in Socrates. And he's doing that thing. He's trying to get these two dialogical figures also to talk to each other. And he's trying to get at, okay, what does this look like? How do we help? How do we work together to give birth to each other, and also, right, to a home in which what we give birth to can properly come to fruition.
Well, and anyone who's been at a birth at the moment of it and heard the cry and felt the presence of all that deep sigh, right?
Yeah,
Like everyone in the room just
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
then whatever is remained is just filled with a flood of oxytocin, or whatever
yeah, yeah.
cocktail it is in there, but you're suffused with a deep appreciation for the miracle of life. And that is an element that needs to be conveyed. I think it needs to be refreshed from time to time, else we lose one of those most well orchestrated moments of life, right? Like if we think of like all of the energy and time and effort that went into that moment, it makes sense to me that it would be this evocative kind of dramatic thing that has all this has such qualia to it, right? It has such a texture and experience. It has such a richness, and so many of our representations in life miss this entirely. Our conversations don't lead towards a birthing of joy and appreciation for life. They're far more adversarial, most of them.
Yeah, which is unfortunate. I mean, so the birthing, I mean, Socrates is the midwife, and Jesus says, you must be born again,
Yeah,
right? And but not as an individual. What it's, I think it's tended to become in various versions of American Protestantism, which is this individualistic emotional experience. What Jesus was talking about is you must be born again into the kingdom of God,
right.
right? Right, which is again what we're talking about here. And we've forgotten the deep connection between conceptualization, and conception, right? That we shouldn't have lost that connection. We become so beset by our fixation on our concepts that we forget the deeper processes that involved that give birth to conceptualizers, right? We've forgotten that, and so I, I what I want to know, though, I guess, is what, because you alluded to this, and I think Jordan Hall is just bang on about this, right? All of these historical analogies are important. I treat them with respect, to use your verb, and I've talked about this too. I care about them. I care about them deeply, and I'm careful with them. And it's a respectful care.
Mm.
But I've been talking with Andrew Sweeney and Chris, Master Pietro, about this notion, this Latin term inventio, which means both to make, right, and to discover. Because Jordan Hall's point is, while all these historical examples are needed, we need reinventio because we're in a state of accelerating change. So it's not only that things are getting complex, they're getting complex in how they're getting complex, right? Yep. It's a recursive kind of complexification. Not only is that the case, but that is in the face of a set of extinction threats that are also accelerating in their influence and their pervasiveness. It's no coincidence that we had COVID. Right. I've listened to I've listened to a couple right now scientific talks by epidemiologists, biologists are saying, look, we're going to have more of these because the factors that drove this, we're only increasing them. We're messing up, ocean currents, air streams, melting the permafrost, cutting down the rainforests, and we're stressing human beings out. We're compacting them into ever increasingly dense cities. There's all this stuff, and none of that's changing. None of that's going away. And so, all of that said, both the complexification that Jordan Hall talks about, and then the acceleration of the extinction threats means that for all of their cherished value, and I'm not speaking, facetiously here. I mean it. For all the cherished value of these historical analogies, there also has to be something above and beyond them.
They seem inadequate, right?
Yes, they're inadequate. They're helpful.
Right.
They're helpful and they're instructive, but they're inadequate. We need an inventio. We need a reinventio of what we need right now. And so, what is it? Sorry, and you don't have to answer this. This is an open question for us to discuss. What is it we need now? Like, what is it we need? What has to be different than before that will give us what we need to exact all of this wonderful machinery, and I use it in quotation marks, that we're talking about here,
yeah,
such that it is adaptively appropriate to what is happening right now.
Yeah, so like I strongly feel that we're close. Let me say that. I love Jordan's language, and his work in particular introduced me to notions of the difference between chaos and complexity and simplicity and all that. So like you can see where the generator functions spin off into turbulence, right? We can, like you and I can look out and see in the world where it's happening right now. And we're in these little islands of stability still, but nevertheless, it's certainly seems to be the case that the underlying structures are susceptible to these turbulent effects too. And yeah, so that, like, even if you're not presently aware of the fragility of this whole system, it seems quite apparent that there are a number of ways in which it could all collapse very quickly, suddenly, and almost completely. And it's just due to the structure, the way that we've built a lot of these relationships in the world. And I mean, you should look into Daniel Schmachtenberger's work, I think, to really look at the existential threats, or whatever this new language that we're going to use is. Extinctual threat, like
extinction threats. Yeah, extinction threats.
yeah, that's ever present. And okay, so can we say that it's something that we will know when we see it?
Well, I wanted to make sure, first of all, before I answer that, that I understand you clearly. You said you have a sense that it's close. Did you mean that the extinction threats are close,
No,
or that,
that
or the
our coherence,
our
this
co
whatever, yeah, I'm sorry, perhaps it was not clear enough there.
yeah,
And see, there's the clarification process which just
yeah,
occurred so rapidly, and that's, and if I could just compare this in real time with so many other communications I've had with people and how they fail miserably, and like, um,
yeah.
yeah, sorry, but yeah, there is some okay, so let's say on the landscape everything currently exists which we need to solve the problem. It's all
Mm,
present, but it's
okay,
not coordinated, it is not arranged in its strategic and not final implementation, but utilizable, let's say, like it's actually anyhow. So but the question is, will we recognize it when we see it, when this coherence occurs?
right,
And well, if the answer is yes, then what is the character of that feeling inside? Forget about what it is that, if we just do the analysis in the internal instead of the external, let's
yeah,
assume X, right? So internally, what would that look like,
right,
right? And maybe that will give us a clue as to what the external configuration would look like, because
right.
there's always a kind of inversion or of relationships there. Um,
Well, I think it's got to do what we talked about. I mean, it's got to do
okay.
that bridging between the first person, the third person into the second person
Yeah,
perspective. It's got to be doing that. It's got to be giving people, a sense in the of the transcendence into the moreness and the immanence of the suchness. It's got to be doing the furthest reaches of human phenomenology. It's got to
right,
be doing that. It's got to be giving people um, reliable, and I mean systematically, systemically, both reliable amelioration of patterns of self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior, and enhancing all of the connections to themselves, to each other in the world. It's got to
right.
be. It has to give wisdom. I think it has to do all of that. What would you like to
Yeah,
add to
there's
that?
right. So there's a trusting element of trusting a process that tells you where and what you are, right?
Yeah.
And then how you're connected to all of the other
Yes.
relationships within that network. So like a very consistent way to demonstrate that. So like you and I, like, what is our relationship here? What, like, it's it's a very kind of, like, in social settings, it's just this very ambiguous kind of just unspoken relationship that we have here. But like over time, I've developed a trust for what you've said. I've like listened to your words, and so I have an understanding of what you represent in the network. And that gives me a connectedness to the network of this ecology of information that's making sense of the world. It gives me a direct feeling of connection to it, right? So it has to take on that character where I can trust the strong resonance at certain layers, right? Like where the information is being gathered, how it's being distributed, um, and then, right, that trust is in part, I think, demonstrated by my own ability to grasp a certain level of that information, right? To be able to see the network not just in part but in whole to some sense, and that requires like a whole like a pedagogical effort, I think. Right? There's a
Yeah.
sequence
Yeah.
of instructive like elements. Like there are lots of things I had to read in order to get to what I'm looking at right now, and seeing the motions that I'm seeing right now and trying to understand these things. So there's something to that too. So
Yeah.
there's an
There is.
educational element. Yeah.
So that I mean that would link up greatly with Zach Stein's work and the discussions I'm having with Zach about this new model of education. And then so there's like a pedagogy of trust, like an educing of trust. And this goes to what Jordan and I keep circling back to this reinventio of faith, where it's again
Sure.
it's not the assertion of propositions, but I like what you're saying. You have this. It's not like I'll know it when I see it. And then let me give you maybe a way to revise the analogy.
Sure.
Uh, that well,
Please.
so like this is from Cogsci, right? So when you do experiments with people, you can do what's called feeling of warmth. So first of all, you have a feeling of knowing whether. So have you ever had the experience? Oh, I know that person's name. I just can't remember it right now. You have a feeling of knowing. Okay, now what? Instead of having that as a one shot, think of it as something that's unfolding across time, and call that a feeling of warmth. So now what I do is I'm going to give you a problem, and this problem is going to require insight to solve it. And what I can ask you is, well, how close are you to an answer? How close are you to an answer? And initially, nothing. And then what happens is people get this sudden increase in feeling of warmth. And that this is before they get the answer. But this sudden increase in the feeling of warmth is their sense that there's going to be an insight, right? It's this. So it's like you said, I'll recognize it when I know it, but rather than that just being a static thing, this is I'm proposing to you that it's more of a dawning phenomena,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's more of a dawning phenomena, like it's a reciprocal opening of the feeling of warmth.
No,
That
that's well said. Right.
right?
Yeah, it's not binary, right? It's a
Yeah,
gradient of some
yes,
kind. Sure.
exactly, and it's accelerating. And part of what the hope is, right? Boy, we're bringing back faith, hope, and love, right? Part of what the hope is that that acceleration I'm sensing is going to be equal to the acceleration of the challenges I'm
Right.
facing.
Correct. Yeah. So that's great. Yeah. So the design criteria are very much ones of success, right? You got to be able to successfully navigate whatever the hell this crazy modern landscape is. Um, and yeah, it has to maintain a trajectory that was on before of some kind, right? Like
Yeah,
that's our sense that we're on our motion is laminar. It's fluid, right? It's that we're not experiencing turbulence. We're dodging and we're weaving, right?
yeah,
We're getting our way through. Yeah, like
yeah,
there's definitely a feeling to that, even in the presence of like strong kind of neurotic tendencies. I think so
yeah,
like I can like play an instrument, right? Like and the pressure that I feel of like needing to perform a certain kind of like answer to the problem I just made prior, right? Like that tension, that kind of neurotic, can I do it? Can I do it? It's hand in hand with, or maybe it's even supplementing. I'm not sure the whole eventual orchestration of the answer itself, the
that's
feeling that
right.
it's going to come.
Yeah,
So yeah, I don't know. Like it's so strange how it transforms even the tensions of life into a feeling like you are succeeding.
yeah,
This is why jazz, like I think, is such a good analogy for it, because
yep,
you
yep,
often have these like moments of where mistakes or sudden diversions into a place that you weren't quite expecting reconfigure themselves into this kind of new critical understanding of what it was you could have achieved there. So
yeah.
yeah, you're right. Yeah, it is very much a feeling, an ongoing feeling of coming to a solution.
Yeah.
And yeah, a big part of it is this whole pedagogy of trust. Yeah, this way of like uniting, uh, uniting the sources of wisdom, uniting our sense of what it is um, to earn directly from those who have done hard and good work to make sense of this world, right? Because it's not easy.
It's not. But then, as soon as we've articulated this helps to clarify the problem in some ways, because what we can now ask is, what are the challenges to trust? Because let's think, like in the past, ways in which trust was given ahead of time, was like by people having a commitment to shared propositions,
Right.
right? Like, we all go together and we all say the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed, and that means, right, your public declaration of these things engendered my trust in you before I knew you. It helped get it forgave and I mean I'm playing on the word forgive here, but to give ahead of time, right?
Right.
It forgave trust. Now the thing is, we're entering into a space where it's massively pluralistic and where commitments to sets of propositions that we're going to hold to in an unquestioning fashion, that's not part of how this space is working at all,
Right.
right? So the question is, given that many of the previous ways in which human beings have created widespread networks of trust, what are the alternative mechanisms by which we will bring trust into existence in the way you and I have been talking about?
Hmm. Yeah. So that's of course the one of the questions probably, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So again, maybe that's like a feeling question. What is it? Trust is a feeling. It's almost like hmm. Maybe trust doesn't have a feeling, but it's associated with the feeling often. Um,
Yeah, I think the feeling is more like a criterion. Here's an analogy for you. I get a sense of conviction when I'm perhaps in contact with the truth, right? My sense of conviction isn't the truth. It's something that helps me home in on the truth, right?
right.
Um,
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. So
like mutual. I mean, one of the things and you mentioned this earlier, the weird and wonderful intimacy of this medium, right? Because mutually accelerating disclosure generates trust, and so like you said, when we're creating a culture around the weird way in which your face and my face are so close and so large, but not like if you were this large in my visual field, like
Mhm.
we'd be having a like my physical visual field, we'd be having sort of a, even if we like each other and I like you, but
Yeah.
there'd be all this machinery going, oh no, right? But there's something about the medium, and then there seems to be a cultural grammar that's springing up around it that says, well, one of the things we can do here, right? One of the things we can do here is that intimacy can be exacted for a kind of slowly, like, and there's got to be wisdom in this. There has to be finesse, but a finesse, mutually accelerating disclosure so that trust is possible between people.
Yeah. Well, so this is. I mean, I'm glad you went that way too, because I was kind of going the other side, which is like there's not just there's a yin and the yang to it, right? There's a
Yes,
massive, there's a passive and an active aspect to this, which is something like you're not just going to be receiving and trusting, but a big part of that receptive element is knowing how you are capable of giving trustworthy information,
yes,
right?
yes,
And to be
yes.
engaged in that process lends you a respect for it, right?
No, that's brilliant. I just want to put a pin in that. That's brilliant. That there's an interdependence between trust and being trustworthy.
Right.
Right. Yes, yes, that's very well said. And the virtue, and just like there's a corresponding and aligned even, um, relationship between understanding and being an understanding person.
Right. Yeah, and knowing how deep it can go, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And yeah, there's something to that, and allowing people to get there,
Yeah.
right? You have to afford them the space of doing it incorrectly, and this is where the forgiveness element usually comes in. It's
Yeah.
grace, however you want to form words. There's something related to just affording people the chance to make a mistake and then try again. Jordan Hall uses a certain language like the Omega rule.
Yep.
There's certain things that like you're affording people a chance to speak what is truly from their perspective and to be what they are. And then in that space, if the dialogos is taking place properly, the gap that's afforded that is filled by the transjective rather than the individual.
I
And
agree.
that sense of filling is like you feel like it is it's invigorating, it's innervating, right? That's that is like a fuel for the whole social relationship, I think. It's what it's very Pentecostal perhaps, but it's like
Yeah.
that. It's like the that's what they're seeking, right? That's really what they're trying to evoke. But
Yeah.
in some bizarre overextending of the notion. But yeah, there's something to that too, which is very trustworthy because it's involving so many of these integrated functions in our skulls of mush here, right? Like
Yeah.
they've really, I mean, like these things are quite good at understanding the world, and if we could just trust, if we could trust that full integrated sense, I think, in the presence of all of the whole network, trusting each of the nodes, man, it's such a phenomenal experience. It really is. Like, um,
So,
yeah,
so this refines the question even more. So we're starting to get a bit of an answer. around this, and I think we're making really good progress. But then the question comes up that why many people are absenting themselves from this, of course, is that they have had their trust betrayed.
Yeah.
And this medium, now let's talk about the dark side of it. This medium that we're in right now is one of the most betraying mediums that has ever been generated by humankind, right? It misleads, misdirects, misinforms, gets people caught up for its own, so that they can be exploited. It gets them caught up in adversarial processing, adopting antagonistic narratives. It gets them to rage, outrage, and because all of these things help, quickly and quickly make things salient, so that they're saleable, right, and all that sort of stuff. And so there everything that you and I've said is we're doing it. That the medium can afford it, but I see that why many people would, maybe even somebody listening to this right now will say, "Oh yeah, but I was on this space or I was on this Discord server, and man, and my trust was betrayed, and I got caught up in this, or and the way this medium, especially under COVID, it's just accelerated echo chambering and malicious conspiracy theories and all of that. So there's not only an internal question of how can people in good faith come in to trust within a pluralistic, etc., right? There's also the question of, but what do we do in this culture about the perennial threat of bad faith? The perennial threat of bad faith. Because there's a lot of bad actors exercising bad faith in this space.
Yeah, so I think this is super important. Oh yeah. Yeah, because I've been looking, man. I've been looking for some successful element of like community building. And these efforts have been extensive, right? Like probably like since the 60s, maybe late 50s. A lot of really strange and interesting ways in which people have been trying to come together in a different way than what is kind of like a derivative element. It's like it's like the it's like the remnants or the leftover spaces after the cubicles are constructed and the minds are built, right? Like that's what our culture inhabits, right?
Right.
It just feels hodgepodge and disintegrated, and domicidal, I suppose. But yeah. So sorry, I'm a very visual thinker.
That's good.
Sometimes I get caught up with the picture of something quite, the notion of something quite something quite beautiful, actually, that's developing here. Yeah, so, okay, sorry, trust. When it's transparent, okay, so, and when your node, so let's say like you and I are together, and let's say I'm a bad actor, and I'm trying to like convince you to do something. And, if it was just you and I, you're susceptible, you're prey to only one element of trust, right? So like you have your capacity, well, I guess two, right? It's two tokens, your assessment, my assessment, and combined that you'll decide what to do. But if there's a third element watching, and then they can tell you, well, hey, wait a minute, interaction is a little strange. Like, and if you increase the network, if the number of disinterested parties that potentially have access to a transaction of trust increases, I think, or decreases, we would say, the likelihood that the individual will attempt a strategy of
right
distrust.
Right. So this is the idea of that every dialogue has to be set within the meta dialogue.
Yes.
Right? Of the dialogue between dialogues and the meta dialogues. Right. And what you want is a dynamically recursive structure there. Right. Yeah.
Right. Nested relationships of trust.
Yeah.
And each of them affording an access to like the whole network.
Yeah.
Right. It's something I'm trying to experiment with. In fact, with my own, I'm building a social network called the Metagora. And I'm hoping to demonstrate some aspect of that right there, which is that you foster an environment which is capable of this trustworthy element, right? And then you allow it to, in an ephemeral way, produce its own content, right? And
Yeah.
I'm hoping that it will be, be worthwhile to see how it is that that has an influence on whether or not people attempt strategies of, well, I don't know what to call them exactly, but
I don't want people gaming.
sinful strategies.
Well, yeah, well, I don't want people gaming the system.
Right. Gaming.
Language.
Well, so
Yeah,
right. So like once you have some set of rules, like that's what I've noticed, right? I mean, once you have a set of rules, it's relentless. Like
yeah,
you get eyes on it, people will they will find out how to break it and exploit it, and
yeah,
it's
yeah.
fascinating. Like and in fact, that's what I'm going through right now. I'm inviting people on the platform that can like attack it, and I know that they already have find ways to exploit it. And
Right.
yeah, but the okay, so establishing that interrelatedness and not allowing people to think that they're in some isolated pocket that has uh nobody's eyes on it, let's say. If there's, and
Right.
this is what's so fascinating about this notion of like an ever-present God watching over you. I
Yeah, yeah,
think it naturally evokes in many people that kind of overwatch sense.
yeah.
Yeah.
There's empirical evidence for this. Yeah, and some of it is really, really, it's almost startling. So you put out you don't have any human being monitoring the coffee urn where people are going to take coffee, right? But there's a cup there that where you're supposed to put in some cash for every time you have a cup of coffee. And if it's just that, people won't do it. But then what you do is above the cup where you're supposed to put the deposit, you just put a picture of two human eyes. People are more likely to put money into the cup, right? Yeah,
Fascinating.
so, yeah. So there's definitely that sense. But of course, that also carries with it threats of Big Brother, right? So there is no way to sort of like, oh well, that's the solution kind of thing.
Well,
But
but there is sort of, right. So like, and I think this is one of the keys.
okay, please,
Let's say whatever eyes have access to you, if you have access to it,
yeah,
that gives you the trust loop, right?
yeah,
That's the pedagogy of trust, because I'm scared of Big Brother watching because I can't see Big Brother, right? But
right.
if I were able to port into Big Brother and I had a camera watching the dudes watching the screens that were watching me, right? Like I'm like, okay, well then we've closed the loop and now we're all watching each other and we're all good. Like that's
No, no, that's well said. So that's a sense in which this technology and sort of, you'll allow me an analogy, its hypertext capacities
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
could help alleviate this problem. It would be good to try and bring some of these design features like into like the Discord platform, or at the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord platform. Trying to bring some of these design features actively in there, I think would be a helpful thing to do. Yeah, this is really good stuff we're doing here right now.
No, yeah, I really appreciate it. And any input you have in this whole process would be really appreciated. Like this work that I'm going to be doing with Tim, I think a lot of it's going to be based on work that Forrest Landry is doing.
Yeah,
And yeah, I'm just,
I got to talk to Forrest. I keep
yeah,
asking.
I'd love to talk with him too.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, there's people that keep recommending I talk to him. Um, I think Jordan Hall is going to try and get it so I can talk to him. I think that would be a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, yeah, and I may have an opportunity to speak in the next uh, day or two. I'm not sure because I've got a pretty flexible schedule, so I might be able to squeeze in. But yeah, I'm very hopeful that the efforts that are coming from all of these converging things are 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 providing, they're continuing to provide some measure of sense making of the world that is affording us the capacity to build a sustainable future, right? It's a sustainable relationship with each other, and one that we enjoy and appreciate and that feeds back into itself. Um, and closes that loop. And that is one that I think affords that to as many people as possible. That's such an important element of it.
I I hope. Well, I hope you're right. And I work. This came up in a discussion with Lehman. I I I I'm going to try everything I can to do that. But I sometimes comfort myself in the middle of the night when the darker aspects of this come to mind, that even if this project, and this is where the comparison, and I hope I'm not being pretentious, the comparison to Augustine comes in, right? Like, the barbarians are literally at the gate, and he's writing the city of God, and he's comparing the city of God to the city of man. I comfort myself that even if we, in some sense, fail we may be sowing the seeds or preserving the candles for what is going to come afterwards, the way
Right.
he did. Um, and so for me, that gives, I mean, I'd rather it be the former than the latter, but that's a way of conceiving of the latter that at
Sure.
least means that I don't fall into, there isn't a temptation to sort of a kind of despair about this. Again, the latter is horrible because it means a lot of suffering and distress, but it means that, but there's even the possibility of ameliorating that by what I'm doing with you right here, right now.
Right. It's incredibly valuable, these efforts, right? And it's a good thing to be engaged in. At the very least, it seems to be training myself up, right? Like
Yep.
I
Yep.
feel stronger engaging in attempting to understand and listening to all of the profound insights that other people like yourself are having, and then and granting to the total network. Yeah, I don't get a sense that it's wasted effort at all.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think if we can find a way to allow people to get to know each other, and to get to know themselves, and then to feel strong enough and capable enough and trustworthy enough that they can integrate into like-minded individuals, I think we'll see those groups of people produce um, truly phenomenal things, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I would supplement that by saying that they have to get together. They have to get together. Here's what I'm trying to say. Dialogos and ecologies of practices need each other.
Right. Yes.
They need each other, right? That the dialogos, the people have to get together, and there has to be the dialogos, but the dialogo, they also have to get together for ecology to practices, which doesn't
Right.
mean everybody's doing the same ecology. That's what came out of the movement summit. It's that we all have, we use the best cognitive science to understand the important principles of any ecology of practices, and then people have their particular variety because you have your own idiosyncratic history, and certain things are going to take for you in the way they don't take for me, and vice versa. And so getting that sort of universal set of principles that are enacted in a pluralism of ecology of practices, I think that also needs to be part of what's going on here.
Yeah, absolutely. You're affording kind of the pluralism, right? The ability for this multi-perspectival process to afford a better view of the whole structure. And that's necessarily, I think, going to indicate a pluralism, especially if the thing that you're examining has characteristics which are amenable to a certain kind of expertise.
Yeah,
I think just the natural capacity for language to specialize and for experience to isolate into a particular adaptive niche, and you can't really escape that if you have a certain set of
you should.
consistent patterns in the environment. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So I'm happy to watch and afford that process, to see it unfold, and I don't know, I'm just terribly gratified to be a part of it. It's
Yeah, it is. It is.
yeah,
I feel the same way too. Well, that we've talked for quite a while. I think this is a good place to draw it to a close.
sure,
Uh, I would like it if we talked again in the future. I invite you to come back to Voices with Vervaeke. I found both of these discussions really helpful. And I even liked the way we were exemplifying. We got into the pattern of actually doing dialogos and doing the reciprocal clarification and the drawing out of each other and the joint clarification, and like it was not only the material that we were discussing, it was the manner of our discussion that I thought was also valuable.
yeah. I very
So
much appreciated it. Thank you
yeah,
for the expertise that you demonstrate, and the care. Really, that's the word that keeps coming back to me, is the care,
yeah,
is that
there
kind of
is.
care.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so thank you, Tyler. And like I said, let's do this again, and we'll set it up.
Yeah. Thank you, John.
Thank you.